I'm really delighted to be here today with Gabe Wynant to talk about his new book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. Gabe is an assistant professor at the University of History at the University of Chicago, where he works on questions around inequality and the history of capitalism. And he's also a prolific writer, one of those people I have on my read everything they write list, with work appearing in a wide range of venues, including the New York Times, N+1, New Republic, and elsewhere. The Next Shift, which is the subject of our discussion today, is a truly path-breaking work of historical scholarship, offering, I think, one of the most insightful interpretations into how the world of work has changed from the end of the Second World War to today. The book confronts this process that we've all witnessed and experienced and certainly heard commentators talk about, which is the decline of manufacturing and the rise of service employment, and in particular, healthcare employment. And it asks, why exactly did that happen the way that it did? To bring this question to life, Gabe focuses on Pittsburgh, which was once home to the largest steel industry in the world. There's a reason why the football team there is called the Steelers, and which is now, like many other deindustrialized cities like it, the site of a sprawling medical industrial complex. As you know, just one illustration of this, which I didn't know, the former U.S. Steel Tower, U.S. Steel was once the largest industrial corporation in the world. Former U.S. Steel Tower is now emblazoned with the letters UPMC for University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. UPMC is today the largest private employer in Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania aren't unique. In most metropolitan areas in what we call the Rust Belt, and in fact in some states like Pennsylvania, hospital systems are the largest employers. What Gabe shows in this book, in incredibly powerful detail, I would add, is that this transition wasn't a coincidence. There's a process here that we have to understand. So let me stop talking and get to him. Gabe, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Samir. It's really great to join you and to have this event at CUNY at the School of Labor Studies, an institution that I feel some connection to and great inspiration from.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. And actually, I should note, Gabe, prior to my taking over as the Books and Arts editor at New Labor Forum, Gabe was the editor of Books and Arts, so we can kind of claim him as one of our own, I think. So let's get started. I mean, you start the book by looking at this peculiar healthcare system that we have in the United States. It's built around private employer-based insurance for most of the population, with the exception of Medicare and Medicaid, which we'll get to, as well as a vast and almost entirely private system of providers, from hospitals to outpatient clinics and nursing homes and so on. And you ask where this thing came from. A central point you make in the book is that it has somewhat surprising origins, perhaps, for the audience, which is that it originated in the industrial economy of the mid-20th century. So can you start by explaining what that industrial economy looked like and how it laid the groundwork for the healthcare system that we've all inherited?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key point to begin with is that if we think of the concept of social citizenship established by the New Deal, that's access to social rights like retirement, healthcare, etc. The New Deal state, constructed in the 1930s and 1940s, eventually landed on a system for dispersing social rights through private sector employment. My own graduate school advisor, Jennifer Klein, her book For All These Rights is really important in showing how this worked. But if we take the case of healthcare in particular, we can see this really, really clearly, right? At the end of the 1940s, when Truman was president, he staged something of a campaign for what we would now call Medicare for All. He ran into, intense opposition from the medical establishment, from a kind of rising Cold War, anti-communist type sentiment. And as that campaign ran aground, his main social base, his main coalition, which consisted of industrial unions, the UAW, the United Steelworkers, the miners, and so on, they kind of made a calculation to withdraw their strength from that campaign and instead to invest their political capital in winning private sector plans from their own employers. So you start to see healthcare and pensions as well become a component of collective bargaining at the end of the 1940s. It's in 1949 that the court system says, in fact, it's a mandatory component of collective bargaining. That comes out of a steel industry case. And that's really how like employment-based health insurance proliferates across American society. That's really, I mean, it existed in little forms before this, or in discrete pockets before this, but the way that it really proliferates is through the link forged by collective bargaining. The second piece of this I want to say is that if you then think about places like Pittsburgh or like New York or Philadelphia or Detroit, places with big industrial economies that are heavily organized in the 40s and 50s, you can then imagine what the consequences of this kind of private sector health insurance through collective bargaining would be on the healthcare market, right? Which is that hospitals previously had basically been a place where the poor go to die. And instead they realized, oh, people can pay for this now. We should invest, we should grow, we should get new equipment, we should build a new wing. And the healthcare market begins to grow intensely in response to, the steelworkers in Pittsburgh winning their health plan.
So yeah, I mean, I want to kind of follow up on both of those points, because I think they're both relevant to the political economy of healthcare today. So I mean, on the one hand, so where you start is with an organized working class, the steel workers, the auto workers, and others winning good private insurance, and as a result, sort of taking the winds out of the sails for a more robust public program like the one that Truman had initially proposed. On the other side of this is that this private demand creates an industry that's privately administered, and that private demand and that private supply create a dynamic that begins to bid up healthcare prices. And ever since that point, controlling healthcare costs has been a big part of the policy discussion around this issue. In the book, you really skillfully bring these two threads together to show one other interesting kind of consequence of this, which is how this peculiar market structure actually, in a way, served to strengthen the political movements that were being waged by those who were excluded from it, namely those too old to work and those who were shut out of the high-wage, well-organized workforce. And those struggles eventually resulted in Medicare and Medicaid. So can you talk about this history a little bit and what the advent of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965 did to this system that had been developing in the early post-war years?
Yeah, so if we kind of continue the scenario, right, we now have these kind of growing healthcare systems responding to this new market in industrial cities. And it's worth saying, in a place like Pittsburgh, I just want to make clear, when we talk about it being an industrial city, I mean, in 1950, basically half of all employment, I think it's 47% of all employment in the Pittsburgh area, was in manufacturing, mining, construction, trucking, warehousing, and rail. So it's an extremely blue collar kind of community. And all of those industries are organized. Steel is obviously the largest component, right? But it's not the only one either. So if you think about, right, the impact they're having on this healthcare system, it's growing in response to this new market. As you say, prices then start to go up. And as prices go up, the poor and the elderly, who are the two constituencies that can't necessarily get healthcare through employment for obvious reasons, either they're shut out of this kind of employment-based social citizenship by the fact that they don't have these jobs, and that begins to tell you a kind of racialized story about who has more and less access to good collectively bargained industrial jobs, or they're too old to have these jobs, but one way or the other they can't afford healthcare anymore because in fact the system is getting more expensive. And already by the late 50s, you're starting to see pressure on congressional on members of Congress coming from this source, and kind of growing political buzz around it. They start to kind of pass temporary or sort of partially formed legislation that will eventually develop into Medicare and Medicaid by the mid 60s. But I think I don't want to gloss over the kind of struggle that resulted in Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. But I think it's fair to say, but by the end of the 50s already, some version of that legislation had become inevitable, because this particular structure of routing healthcare to the working class through industrial employment was going to create this unevenness and was going to create this huge political problem. Now, once Medicare and Medicaid do pass, which eventually, they do quite easily, it becomes a kind of consensus question, basically. Once they do pass, it's we can notice, if we look at this, what that means for the structure of the healthcare economy, right, that they don't upend it, they don't overturn it, they don't displace any of what's been established since the 40s. They just round it out, right? They say, okay, we have this system through private sector employment for dispersing health insurance to a lot of the population, but it's created this kind of problem on the margins. So let's just deal with this problem on the margins. And it positions the federal government and state governments with Medicaid as buyers of private healthcare, right? As opposed to providers of it, or as opposed to changing in any way the kind of privatized structure that we've been talking about.
And I guess I just to kind of hang on to that last point. This a theme that comes up in your book a lot is this distinction between a demand subsidized healthcare market and perhaps what we might call sort of a supply or a public supply side story. The British case, the National Health Service, is sort of maybe the classic case, though in the US we have the VA, where there's direct provision of care by the public sector, whereas in the US we have public subsidy on the demand side. And I do, this issue of cost control keeps, it's sort of the ghost that haunts our healthcare system to this day. And I guess, can you just talk a little bit about the way in which this demand side model is undergirding these constant inflationary cycle that we see in healthcare?
Yeah. So, I mean, we all know this all too well now, right? When we talk about the politics of healthcare, we talk about how much it costs. And when we experience it in our own lives as patients, right? Similarly, then we experience it as like, Jesus Christ, this costs so much. And, I think there are complicated social factors that we can talk more about that make up that problem. But a key institutional component of it, as you're saying, Samir, is that the way that the political problem of health security was solved over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And I want to emphasize, right, it's a political problem, right? There are people who are demanding access, who think that, for a variety of reasons, quite understandably and appropriately and deserving of our solidarity, they deserve access. This presents a political problem. It creates pressure at all levels of, from collective bargaining all the way up to federal policy. And the main way that it's solved is to open the faucets in terms of subsidizing demand. Right, Medicare and Medicaid are the most powerful example of that. But even something like, the classification of health insurance as a mandatory subject of collective bargaining is a version of that. It's a regulatory version as opposed to a social insurance version. And it's even the case that Medicare begins to, after its passage in 65, begins to subsidize supply in a certain way, right? In that hospitals can pass through capital costs to a great degree to the public so that they can grow in response to this rising demand, rising subsidy for demand. They can grow and grow and grow. But this remains completely privately controlled in most situations, right? So the public is footing the bill in various ways, right? It's kind of paying for people's consumption of healthcare. It's paying even for the supply of healthcare to grow, but the administration remains private. And this is inevitably going to generate, or near inevitably maybe, going to generate a political problem in the form of inflation, which is a question ultimately about how much healthcare do we want people to consume politically, right? That's a political struggle that takes the form of a conflict over the cost and inflation.
Right. No, that's and I think it's just worth noting in recent decades, as we've seen so many industries stagnate. The one industry that we see continually balloon has a lot of public investment coming into it through either the demand side or through these channels that you describe of Medicare, providing reimbursement for capital costs and the like. Even in an era in which the public sector, as you know, has been retrenched in so many other areas, this has not. And we can talk about why this has been so politically insulated from some of the other forces over the last few decades. But before we get sort of more to the present, I want to just revisit this industrial economy upon which this entire system was built. So we've got, coming out of World War II, a well-organized working class, a booming industrial economy, and the construction of this privatized or semi-privatized welfare state. But just before you know it, that system starts to break down, right? As a result of whether it's automation or international competition or capital flight. By even the 50s and 60s, we see a process that we now call deindustrialization playing out. And these days, especially people who watch too much cable news tend to think that the only thing that deindustrialization produced are white male hard hat Trump voters, right? But you have a very, very different perspective on some of the consequences of this process. One that's informed by attentiveness to the uneven impact of deindustrialization. For instance, that process was very much racialized all along, with communities of color feeling the effects of job loss before others. And it was gendered, with the economic necessity resulting from deindustrialization increasingly compelling working class women to enter the formal labor market. And all of this impacted the expanding healthcare industry. So could you talk about the ways in which deindustrialization gave shape to the workforce who did the labor of healthcare, and how it ensured that workforce is going to look the way that it did?
Yeah. So as you suggested, deindustrialization, it begins basically, it's starting to show up, or what we can now recognize as the first signs of it are starting to show up basically as soon as the Korean War is over in the mid-1950s. Between 1950 and 1980, the steel industry loses about as many jobs in Pittsburgh as it would lose then again between 1980 and 1990, which is the decade of really rapid decline that we kind of think of as when Pittsburgh lost the steel industry. So actually half the work was done already by 1980 in terms of job loss. As you say, that plays out in kind of racially uneven forms. So in the steel industry, as in many organized industries, seniority was by the shop or department as opposed to plant-wide. This typically meant, until the 1970s, this typically meant that Black workers would get stuck in both the least desirable jobs, that would be in the blast furnace and in the open hearth to some extent, and the coke ovens, the really hot and toxic jobs, and also would generally be the kind of first to be laid off, last to be rehired. Classic story, of race and labor markets across industrial America. So, that meant that whatever kind of fleeting version of a stable post-war labor capital compact momentarily seemed to exist for the working class as a whole never existed for the Black section of the working class, right? That Black workers might in moments, be able to spend a few years in the steel mill before they got laid off again. But they were always having to secure economic survival through a more complicated set of, strategies. Cooperative strategies often, right? There's, all kinds of stories I come across of just, people moving in together, sharing food, sharing housing, sharing clothes, watching each other's kids. I remember a story of someone I interviewed telling me about how her mom would know when she knew there was a contract expiring coming up, and presumably a strike coming up, her mom would go into the country and buy up a bunch of vegetables cheap, and then bring them back to the city and can them, and just lay in stores and like share them with her family. And there's just a million things like that especially African American workers figured out how to do to kind of manage the disruption that was already eating into their economic security in the 50s and 60s. But as you said, this process also compels African American women into wage work. Has always compelled African American women into wage work at higher rates than white women, because there's never been as much economic security. But we can see that phenomenon happening really clearly in the 60s. Healthcare work becomes the main destination for African American women seeking wage work, and they start to transition out of domestic work, which had been the largest sector of employment prior to this, and into healthcare work as that market is booming. So they're kind of the first to arrive in this new era, and it's better than domestic work in a lot of ways, but it's still, I mean, it's worth saying how marginal healthcare work was deep into the post-war period. The National Labor Relations Act was only extended to cover hospitals and nursing homes in the 1970s. The Fair Labor Standards Act, so hours and wages rules, only in the late 60s. So, you have women whose husbands have lost their job at the mill or are on temporary layoff. They figure, I need a new job or a better job. I'll go down to the hospital and see if they're hiring. And they get a job there, paying sub minimum wage in some cases, right? And that becomes the kind of basis of the emerging healthcare working class.
And this is happening. We're talking about Pittsburgh here, which is very much, as you said, a union town, right? In these decades, these jobs that these women and women of color in particular are entering in hospitals. What's the union story there?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, to this day, that sector is largely non-union, both nationwide and in Pittsburgh. There, SEIU has succeeded in establishing some bargaining units, and a couple big ones, a couple small ones over the years. But certainly in the 1960s, it was completely non-union. And in fact, it's worth saying just briefly, when the Wagner Act was first passed in 35, the status of healthcare under it was unclear and was litigated and fought over for about a decade. And there was a nurses union of largely African-American nurses that formed, a CIO union that formed at a Pittsburgh hospital, which led to a legal dispute over whether or not they, were protected under the Wagner Act. And then finally, these questions were resolved by the Taft-Hartley Act, which explicitly said in 1947, along with establishing right to work and various other inhibitions on the labor movement, explicitly excluded healthcare workers. As many, I'm sure, of the people on this call know this story, right? That didn't stop healthcare workers from organizing over the course of the post-war years, and in particular, Local 1199 out of New York really kind of developed a powerful and militant hospital workers union, beginning in New York, in particular with Montefiore Hospital being a kind of heroic struggle in the 50s. And then over the course of the 60s, beginning to kind of expand around the country in tandem with the civil rights movement, because African-American workers, in particular African-American women, were such a large portion of the hospital workforce. And because it had this quality of a civil rights struggle, because the thing that they were fighting over was precisely the denial of the forms of citizenship that even other members of the working class had gained access to. So that struggle shows up in Pittsburgh in late 1969. There's a big campaign to organize some of the major hospitals there in the late 60s. And into 1970, led by Local 1199, Coretta Scott King is in town. There's a whole kind of series of rallies and demonstrations and strikes, and they lose. I mean, that's like the simplest way to put it. Is that partly because management proves able to divide the white workers against the black workers. I think that's the most significant factor. But also, they're unprotected by labor law, right? And the mechanisms of militancy that Local 1199 had drawn on in other struggles to overcome that obstacle are insufficient in the Pittsburgh case. And they fire a bunch of the activists, and they engage in a kind of like they bring in a kind of company union sort of thing, and they keep the union out, and it remains out to this day. And the descendant of those hospitals that 1199 was fighting with then are today UPMC, which remains an inveterate violator of the NLRA.
Yeah, and you noted, I think the first page of your book, you quote a UPMC lawyer or executive saying, we have no employees, which, speaks to the sort of enduring way in which fights over, the definition of an employee affect this industry. As they affect many others, as they affect Uber, as they affect, graduate teaching assistants in certain, or have in the past. So this is the legacy. I mean, there's a great documentary called I Am Somebody about, in that same time period, 1199's big famous strike in Charleston, South Carolina. And you watch that, and I mean, it's a heroic struggle, and you think, oh well, but it's South Carolina, it's Charleston, South Carolina. It was going to be really tough no matter what. Pittsburgh's a union town, and the story and the way that it played out is not dissimilar. And so let's talk about, I mean, sort of the legacy of, I suppose, what we could call that defeat and the non-union industry that remains to this day largely. Um, One distinctive feature about healthcare work then and now is that it's very labor intensive. You need human beings to do this. You can't really automate it. And as a result, labor costs loom large. You focus in the book a lot on how hospital administrators think about these costs, and they're obsessed with them because they need to control them in order to maintain profit margins. It's fairly straightforward. So one way you can control them is by keeping wages low, right? And another that you point out is to try to get more work out of fewer workers. So could you talk about this issue of healthcare labor productivity, or to use a more straightforward term, staffing, and how this has affected healthcare workers and their organizing efforts then and today?
Yeah, well, I think it's useful in thinking about this to take a step back to manufacturing, right? And this moment, which was fleeting and which was never really stable, but this moment that we think of when there was this kind of agreement between employers and employees, and both could kind of prosper together, once workplaces were organized in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and everybody kind of rose together. To the extent that that was true, which is limited, but to the extent it was true, it was because at an economic level, right, industries that are able to increase their productivity in a kind of ongoing way, produce more per person hour or whatever, right, they generate a surplus that they can that it's possible to kind of share with labor, right, and that labor can make a claim on if it's organized. And in lots of interpersonal kinds of service work, including what you and I do, I think, you can't get that same effect, right? Because it's not amenable to automation or mechanization in the same way. And because to the extent that you can subdivide tasks to produce more efficient outcomes, you risk degrading the quality of the service. And certainly this happens, right? I mean, employers do this all the time in the service economy, in healthcare, in education. But there's always a kind of push and pull, because employers have to test the boundary of how far can I go in taking what is a kind of interpersonal relationship and breaking it down into a set of kind of mechanical operations that can be divided among different people. And anyone watching this who has worked in a healthcare context or even been a patient in a healthcare context, right, can probably think of times when it seems like a nurse or a doctor is paying attention to you, or if you are a nurse or a doctor and you have the opportunity to actually pay attention to someone, and times when you can tell that's not in the cards. So because of this kind of structural inherent limit on productivity, steady productivity advancement in the healthcare industry, employers, as you say, they have to find another way to make their margins work. If we're going to have private health insurance or healthcare provision, right, this is a problem you're going to have. And to the extent that they can pass on costs to the patient, that's great. They're happy to do that. As again, we've all seen in healthcare bills. But there are limits on doing that sometimes, right? Maybe in the form of competition, maybe in the form of regulation. And so to the extent that they can pass on the cost to labor, they're going to try to do that too. And that takes the form of trying to hold down wages. And I think, folks who come out of the healthcare union world have encountered this, right? Where if you unionize a healthcare workplace, there are gains you can make, but you also hit a limit, right? Because the employer is going to say to you pretty soon, that's not under our control, right? That has to do with the reimbursement rate from the government. That has to do with the reimbursement we get from the insurer. We just, like, the money doesn't really come from us, it comes from them. And the truth is, there's reality in that, right? And so they, for that reason, that their operating budgets are kind of being determined somewhat from outside, healthcare providers are always trying to hold down wages, and if they can't do that, to get fewer people to do more of the work. I think this is a really familiar phenomenon now to anyone who works in the healthcare sector. Right? I mean, every healthcare worker right now talks about understaffing, and it's because it's emerged, I think, for healthcare employers as their main solution to this productivity problem, which is just to sweat the people who work for them as much as they can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And I guess, well, building off of that, talking about, speaking of sort of low wages and intensifying burdens of work, much of our discussion thus far is focused on inpatient care. We're talking about hospital systems and the like, but in the book that hospital employment actually peaked in the early 90s, but healthcare employment more broadly has continued to surge. More and more people are working in long-term care facilities, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts that home care work will be the single largest occupation in the US by the end of this decade. These are the most poorly paid and overworked workers in the industry, and they're also the ones who've suffered the most during the pandemic. So can you talk a bit about this broader care economy? Why has it grown so much? Why is it still growing so fast? And to what extent is its growth related to this larger story we've been talking about industrial decline?
Yeah, well, I think there's a missing piece in the middle of the story I want to fill in, which I think will get us into that. So as deindustrialization really starts to advance and speed up in the 70s and into the 80s, um, things in places like Pittsburgh fall apart pretty fast. I mean, anyone who lived in an industrial city in that period, I'm sure, can kind of remember a version of this. Um, there was a sort of localized Great Depression. And as that happened, you had a population that was increasingly aged demographically. Younger people, especially younger men, realize they're not going to get a job at the steel mill. They better leave town if they want opportunity. Well, that big cohort that had worked in the mills in the 40s and 50s reached retirement. As it aged, it got sicker, both because older populations are generally sicker populations, and also because it was getting poorer because we're losing jobs, right? So the population's getting older, it's getting sicker, it's getting poorer, and all of that together generates social need, right? It generates people are dislocated in different kinds of ways. They have rising social needs, some of which are obviously healthcare needs, right, related to sickness. Some of which might or might not be, right? There's a question of what really is healthcare versus kind of other kinds of social service. But the healthcare industry is what's there to take care of them. And so all of this, or a lot of this need, becomes healthcare demand. And the simplest way to think about this is imagine someone who gets laid off, falls below the means test line to qualify for Medicaid for the first time. Their kids have left town because the kids can't get jobs, so the kids aren't there to take care of them. They've got some chronic health problems, so they become a patient in a long-term care facility, and whatever kinds of social needs that they had in terms of needing somebody to check in on them, help them clean their house, take care, get them fed, whatever, right? All of that becomes healthcare. It gets sucked into the healthcare economy. And actually, hospitals themselves have been doing a lot of this. Community hospitals have been doing a lot of this through the 60s and 70s and early 80s because, frankly, people had the insurance for it. It was good for the hospitals. They made money off of it. And so you find, like in all of the little steel towns outside Pittsburgh, places like Homestead, which is one that people on this call will have heard of, but McKeesport, Braddock, a ton of towns like this. There's a steel mill kind of at the bottom of the hill, and then 3 blocks up, there's a hospital that services, the workers who work at that steel mill and their families. And all of these places are kind of running a tidy business in sort of medium-term care. This, as it happens at a national level, causes the national healthcare expenditure to balloon. Right, as all of this social need driven by deindustrialization and rising inequality is channeled into healthcare, drives the healthcare inflation we were talking about earlier even faster and more intensely, and again becomes a political problem. So Congress in 1983 is looking at this basically, and they see that industrial cities are kind of in ruins. The Fed has deflated the economy, jacked up interest rates, thrown all these blue collar workers out of work. But strangely, the healthcare industry hasn't behaved this way. The healthcare industry has kept inflating. We better do something about it. And they change the way they do this is they change the formula by which Medicare reimburses hospitals. This sounds dry, and it's actually incredibly important. Um, so from 65, when Medicare was passed, to 1983, the program, and then private insurers mimicking it, reimbursed hospitals retrospectively, as it was called. This meant that a hospital and the doctors, they did whatever they were going to do, whatever they thought the patient needed, and they calculated how much it cost them, and they sent a bill to Medicare or the insurer saying, basically, here's what it cost, give us 102% of that. This meant that they could kind of write blank checks for themselves, right? And that's why they were able to do this tidy business and expand so much. So Congress says, okay, that's over in 83. And instead, what we're doing now is we have come up with this list of like 500 diagnoses. These are all the possible diagnoses. When you admit a patient, choose which one they have. And you'll see there's a price. And we're going to pay you that much. You can keep the patient for a day. You can keep them for a month. That's your problem. But that's what you're getting paid. And the purpose of this is to introduce kind of market discipline and competition to healthcare. What it winds up doing is the big fancy academic hospitals that have the capacity to do really expensive and technologically complicated or scientifically complicated interventions, things like transplants, they do great with this. Their margins go up. But all of these community hospitals that had been basically running a tidy business as semi-nursing homes start to go under because that model won't work anymore under this system. And so they basically, over about 10 years, they start to go out of business. They get bought up by the rising hospital monopolies. And the work that they had done, kind of taking care of people in this less intensive, kind of more durational way, that shifts out of the hospital context entirely, right, to these much lower margin, even more labor intensive kinds of work in long-term care on the one hand, and long-term institutional care on the one hand, that's nursing homes, and into home care. So that demand, that need is still there, right? And it's still getting managed through the healthcare system, through Medicaid in particular. But it's shifted outward into these less capital intensive contexts where it can be done, the theory is, for cheaper. And those categories of employment at the bottom of the wage scale in healthcare then become the ones basically from the early 1990s to the present that really grow and grow and grow.
That history right there, I mean, that with the change in Medicare in 1983 is just fascinating and terribly important, and I think terribly underappreciated, generally in terms of how this reshaped the provision and also the sort of the geography of healthcare and the concentration of the industry. So, one of the things, back to sort of the symbols of transition. One thing I noted at the outset is that the former U.S. Steel Tower is now the UPMC Tower. Another thing that Gabe notes in his book is that some of these hospitals in these peripheral towns of Allegheny County and in smaller steel towns get gobbled up by the big academic center, and then some of them happen to get closed I believe on the day that U.S. Steel changes its name to USX, and its CEO famously remarks, "We're not in the business of making steel; we're in the business of making profits." It's just such a powerful image of how this all was wound up together. But I want to kind of just follow up on this with, one consequence of this is the sort of expanding size and concentration of the academic medical centers, and they become these behemoths. But another part of this as well, and we've talked about this on previous SLU events, is the increasing penetration of financial sector actors into healthcare markets, private equity firms and other kinds of investors like that, buying rural hospitals, buying nursing homes, and the like. And we've over the last decade, we've seen an increasing number of rural hospital closures. During this pandemic, of course, we saw, catastrophic effects in long-term care facilities. And so can you just talk a bit about about how this sort of financialization resulted perhaps from this and what it's meant for both care, for the provision of care, and for the people who do the work?
Yeah, I think here it's helpful again to go back to the 70s. I mean, in this period when the healthcare system was inflating really rapidly, was absorbing all of this need, all of this demand that was being subsidized from elsewhere in the economy. Um, Part of how that happened is that it's another form of public subsidy. Uh, in the 70s in Pittsburgh, I think it's generally around when this happens in most places, um, they establish a mechanism to basically give hospitals and nursing homes access to municipal bond markets. So this is a tax favored and subsidized form of borrowing, right? And it's generally seen as a pretty safe, safe form of lending. And the idea is that hospitals and nursing homes, they can count on this basically guaranteed income, driven both by the kind of social process of deindustrialization, the demographics of it even, on the one hand, and the ways that health insurance is kind of managing that social and demographic process. So they basically can guarantee that they're virtually guaranteed that they're going to be able to make their bond payments. And you find hospital administrators saying, look, let's build a new wing. The investment bankers say the money's there for it, so there's no reason not to do it. And even in this moment of relatively kind of more generous health insurance of the 1970s, finance capital is already working its way into the system and helping it work, right? Helping kind of the public-private balance hold together. Its footprint naturally kind of increases over time, right? Given that whatever the other things that have happened in our society since then. And in particular, as you get these kind of consolidating healthcare, so as the academic hospitals begin to consolidate their markets, it triggers a market share arms race. At least in a place like Pittsburgh, you have, on the one hand, you have the academic hospital kind of buying up smaller hospitals and consolidating market share, and that starts to freak out the insurer, right? The insurers, because they're recognizing that if you only have one hospital that you're dealing with, one hospital system, they're just going to dictate prices, and so insurers, start to try to buy up hospitals, and hospitals launch insurance programs, and there's this kind of merger arms race happening kind of across the healthcare economy. In the case of Pittsburgh, it resulted, and some folks may even remember this, in the biggest nonprofit healthcare bankruptcy in history still today, which happened in the early 2000s. But basically, one of the non-academic hospital was kind of trying to keep up in this race and bought up a bunch of other institutions that it couldn't really afford on borrowed money, because as the sector has just grown and grown and grown, the money has just been there for it, mm-hmm. And that's because of the public subsidy that can be captured ultimately by lenders. That continues to this day, in particular in long-term care. This is where I think we've seen this kind of most perniciously, right? Private equity especially has realized that it can kind of enter this market and suck up all of this public income that flows into it in the form of Medicaid, in the form of subsidized borrowing, while stripping staffing to the bone. And there's now pretty good research showing that when private equity buys a nursing home, when a private equity firm buys a nursing home, more people are going to die in that nursing home. And I think mm-hmm. This is a really troubling thing that has happened in our healthcare system, and follows from the strange composition of public and private that makes it up.
Right. And that, I was just thinking, you're talking about that bankruptcy in Pittsburgh at the Allegheny Health Education Research Foundation, AHERF, that reverberated actually across the state, with AHERF buying Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia and setting it up for failure, which, it ended up closing about 18, 19 years later, bought by a private equity company. So these things, I mean, the way in which this stuff has just continued to unfold is, as you say, very much with us. Well, I know you're a historian, but I want to close by asking you to sort of speculate into the future just for a little bit. The Biden administration has just released this big jobs plan, and it includes some substantial amount of funding for care work, mainly for home care. And there are reports that the next installment of the infrastructure program, the American Family Plan, is going to have more of this. In a recent New York Times piece, you made the case for even a greater focus on the care economy. So can you talk first just about your thoughts and what you were saying in the Times piece, and second, and more importantly, I would say, on what you think a comprehensive and equitable care policy would look like today?
Yeah, well, I think, the first thing I was trying to say in the Times piece was just that we talk a lot about industrial policy, especially kind of on the left. We often talk about industrial policy, and that's important. And it includes things like generating good manufacturing work, particularly as it is relevant to a Green New Deal type transition. But we also already have an industrial policy in the form of Medicare and Medicaid that we don't think of in those terms. And that's the story the book tells, how our healthcare policy has become this engine of employment, but of bad employment. And it gives up, because really what's happening is the public is subcontracting this work out to these private actors. The public really could exercise more power over it, and really has a lot more latitude than it currently exercises in terms of potentially setting staffing levels, at any institutions that accept Medicare and Medicaid, potentially setting raises or unionization type standards. I mean, none of this is that unthinkable to do. And in fact, you could do through, either administrative action or reconciliation, certainly, in Congress. So, there's an opportunity to lift wages and improve working conditions for this huge and growing sector of the economy, exactly because of how it's been created through political processes, even if it's administered privately. On the larger scale, though, and toward the question about the Biden plan, I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to say that it reflects the rising struggles of healthcare or care workers generally, right? That is why not just Biden, but almost all of the Democratic presidential candidates had some version of this proposal in their platforms. And the organization and power that has resulted from that, I think, is visible in this proposal. I mean, I think basically it's good and it's not enough, that I think we're actually going to find it quite difficult to simply raise wages and, add more subsidy without encountering another version of the very familiar problems I talk about in the book pretty soon, because of the questions of productivity and private administration. So long as we're trying to privately administer the care economy, it's going to hit against this productivity problem again and again and again. Right? So long as there are actors that, either because they're for profit or because they're not for profit, but they have to kind of behave in certain for profit ways, they will find the avenue again of trying to pay for their to increase their margins by taking it out of labor or taking it out of the quality of care, or most likely both. And so, I'm happy to see more subsidy going to the care economy. I think it's important and we should celebrate it. But I think, the reality is that we have to think more ambitiously in the long term about some vision of socializing care. And I don't necessarily just mean like the NHS, although that's an important example, and one that I'd be happy if we had in this country. But, one can imagine all kinds of worker and patient controlled or cooperative type strategies in this economy that would give us much more democratic ways of managing the questions of distribution that arise in it.
Well, I think that's a really great place for us to put a pin in it, Gabe. Thanks so much for doing this. I think this is a wonderful discussion. And let's take it to audience questions now. So to start, we have a question, and I'm not sure what the audience member's name is, but they ask, how does occupational health, industrial medicine, and jobs-based disease fit into how this has all evolved? How have employers shirked job safety by shifting costs to private insurance actors?
Fantastic question. This was my first instinct when I noticed how high the rates of healthcare utilization were in industrial Pittsburgh. And just to kind of give you a sense of this, in 1979, the Pittsburgh region generated per capita 1.6 inpatient days that year. So that's to say, to break that down for you, if everybody in the metropolitan area went to the hospital an equal amount everybody would have spent a day and a half in the hospital that year, which is like insane, right? I mean, that's about triple our current inpatient utilization rate. Of course, that wasn't what happened, right? Everyone doesn't go the same amount. Some people go for a really long time, is what's driving that number. And so, yeah, my first instinct was, well, that has to be because, steel makes people sick. And it's certainly true that steel makes people sick, but it's true in a kind of bigger way than the idea of occupational health seems to suggest. In fact, high rates of utilization were driven as much by steelworkers' families as by the workers themselves, which suggests, one, there's a social effect, like I was talking about earlier, right? That in fact, economic dislocation, economic pressure is in some way manifesting in healthcare utilization. And I think that's important. But two, steel makes the whole region sick, I think is the important version of this that we actually need to try to think about. Right, that like people live in these valleys that have this poison being pumped into the air around them all the time. And there's, some amount of evidence, I think, for this thesis that like living near a steel mill, or if you have 1.5 million people living near 15, 20 steel mills, you have a kind of occupational health effect on the scale of the whole population. And I think that is the kind of most powerful version of this question that's being asked, that in the form of environmental health, the industry is offloading costs onto the private sector in this way, and ultimately onto healthcare workers, right? I mean, that's who is going to deal with this problem in a day-to-day way in a kind of healthcare context, and again, who is going to kind of lend an economic subsidy to it in the form of their own low wages.
Right. And this seems, I mean, this is obviously not confined to Pittsburgh. This is confined to this applies to the carbon economy at large. One of the other consequences of where we've been production wise for a long time. Let me see. We have a question from John Stubbs. Can you mention ideas for ways forward transforming care towards a more compassionate, democratic solidarity economy? And John notes that they work in nursing home.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not. I think there are people who have done more work than me on trying to think this through, and in particular, Ai-jen Poo, and in her book, Age of Dignity. Ai-jen Poo is the leader in the National Domestic Workers Association. Has thought this through and kind of given me some inspiration for it. But it seems to me that we both want to have institutional capacity for taking care of the real and often serious medical needs that institutionalized long-term care can help deal with, and also obviously to the extent that people can be taken care of in more home-like environments, that's in many ways generally preferable, right? And that raises questions, obviously, about the exploitation of their families. That is a real, I think has always been a real risk with elder care and in the care economy. So rather than kind of give a blueprint, I think I'll suggest that one could imagine, right now, nursing homes often have an intermediate and a skilled care section, right? And skilled care is paid for more by Medicare, and intermediate by Medicaid, and they have different levels of intensity. And one could imagine that expanding that vision of kind of compartmentalization onto the scale of a housing complex, right? In which people might, workers and residents might cooperatively own in some way, where, in fact, there might be opportunities for kind of sharing of labor in terms of things like childcare and elder care needs that are sub-medical. I often think about just in terms of like, okay, I live on this block, and my neighbors 2 doors down that way are in their 70s, and my neighbors 2 doors down that way are in their 70s, and like, as basic as like I shovel their walk when it snows, right? And that's not or institutionalized principle, but you can imagine those kinds of relationships being elevated and institutionalized, right, into the form of actual governing principles of how a more democratic long-term care system might function. right, with its own kind of internal democratic institutions and its own internal obligations toward one another of people who inhabited it. But it would require de-ghettoizing the elderly and the disabled to some extent, and accepting that care is something that we all need and all of us are implicated in providing.
I think that that's about as good of a note as we could ask to end on it, and we're about an hour in. So, Gabe, I want to thank you again. This is a really terrific discussion, fascinating book. I really encourage everyone to pick up a copy. The Next Shift and it's also, I might add, just beautifully written and chock full of really moving and heart-wrenching stories all the way through. So, Gabe, thanks a million. This is really fun. And to the audience, thanks so much for being here. And please join us again next time.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks, everyone.